Chris at A to B here. Well, the day has arrived. I know you've all been waiting on this, but we have Cadillac engine parts. Got the crank and block back. Cylinder heads are there on the floor. Got most of the stuff together to put it together. Did basic block prep on it. Didn't figure anybody would want to watch me hammer freeze plugs or core plugs in or oil galley plugs. So I went ahead and did the oil galley plugs myself and off camera. Did the coolant core plugs on the sides. Got all them done. I did go ahead and put the cam bearings and stuff in it too. If you notice right here, I marked where my oil galley hole is because these cam bearings have a hole in them that has to align with that. So it's a good idea to mark with a Sharpie where your oil galley is. That way you make sure that your hole lines up the first time. So I've already got the crank laid in there. We're going to start checking. You can see down in there where I marked the other main webs where the cam bearings, where the cam oil holes are. So anyway, let's I already got the upper halves of the bearings loaded in the block and got the journals cleaned. We were fortunate enough to put up with my fan. It's hotter places here in Indiana. The crank did clean up, surprisingly enough. It was in bad shape, but it cleaned up at 20 under on the mains and 30 under on the rods. I do have the rods and pistons, but they were able to save all the rods also. We were able to resize them all. Got new ARP rod bolts and Keith Black hyper eutectic pistons. Flat tops, getting away from the dish pistons that were in it. Should put us at about 9-to-1 compression with the big chamber heads. As you see, the pistons are marked 30. Let me get it to focus here. They are marked 30 over. Actually, the block would have cleaned up at 20, but these Keith Black pistons available at 30. So that's where we're at. Got the block all painted and all that's taken care of. Sorry, I got my hand in the way of the camera. Just trying to do this real quick. So anyway, let's start check the main clearances with some plastic gauge. Let me get you on. Yes, that is Jackson's truck in here. Sorry for the shaky camera. I was not prepared. Somebody moved my camera stand on me. So what we are going to do is go ahead and load up all the main caps. With where they go, we will start with number 3 main. Number 2. It's not as clean as I would like it. A bit of baked on stuff there. So make sure we don't have any dirt on anything. And surprisingly, the line bore was not bad on this block either, which surprised me. For as hot as it has been and for as damaged as bearings were. So what we are going to do, this is green plastic gauge. Open this up. this little piece of green plastic, you lay it straight with the bearing journal, like so, directly across the top. And then you want to make sure that your bearing tangs always meet. So there's a matching bearing tang in the block. So this tang matches the tang in the block. Sorry, I should have been preparing these tools out. And we'll set our snap-on torque wrench for 90 foot-pounds. I've already looked up the spec on this. We'll set it at 90 foot-pounds. We will put just a dab of ARP fastener assembly on the bolt threads and underneath the bolt head. And you always want to draw these down. You don't want to just hammer them into the bearing register when you're trying to check your bearing oil clearance, because you might smash the gauge beyond what the spec actually is and you won't get a good reading. Snug those up by hand. And then without touching or turning the crank, we're going to torque it. Now, you do not want to turn the crank or anything, and we'll break it back loose and pop the cap off. And we pull this up. Then we use our scale. Bring you guys down here. We use our scale on our package. Get it focused. and it has the width figured into it. Each stripe designates width. I wish I can't get it to focus on it. So we match it up with whichever one's closest. And for this main cap, this main bearing, we are just a tick under 1/1000th, we are right at about 1/1000th oil clearance. Pretty close to 1/1000th. So let's go take a look at the specs here. 1977 motor auto repair manual. Greatest thing in the world. Thank you, Grandpa, for collecting all these books over the years. So we are going to want to find our pistons, pins, rings, crankshaft, and bearings, and our, sorry for the shadow, our main bearing clearance for the 500 V8 1976. Main bearing clearance should be 1/10,000th. Yes, you did hear that right. 1/10,000th to 26,000ths. So we are right in the money there. So actually this thing even specs a pretty tight clearance, because most small block Chevys and stuff of the era would allow up to about 3,000ths clearance. So this thing, even the high side of the spec, is tighter than that. So that shows you the precision that Cadillac built these engines with. So our next thing, we got to clean that off. So get a clean rag. Clean rag and a little bit of carb and choke cleaner. And it polishes off of there like it was never even there. Like it was never even there. So now we do the others. Okay. Turn this crank just a little bit. Get ourselves another piece of plastic gauge. And we will repeat the process for main bearing number 2. Once again, making sure our bearing tangs line up. it to our 90 foot-pounds. And I did chase every thread in this block too. Every threaded hole I ran a chase through it to clean all the machine dirt and grease and grime and anything else that might be in there, because that's one thing you want when you're putting it together. You want everything to go together smooth. Looks like we got another one that's just about right on the money. And that one's, sorry for moving you around. I'm trying not to take the camera off and on the stand. Looks like we're riding just a tick over 1,000th on that one. So far, I am very impressed with this crank. Clean this up. Like it wasn't even there. And then we do the same thing to the bearing. Clean the residue off so it's not there anymore. Off. So I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead here. I'm going to go ahead and check the rest of these off camera, and I'll bring you back when we're ready to button up the crank installation. We'll put the cam in at first and then put the crank in. All right, I got you back here. Sorry for the break. We're actually doing this in 2 different days. Yep, whole different car in the background. A Volvo. You didn't see that. Anyway, got all the bearing clearances checked. Everything looks good on that front. I was about 1,000th on all on mains number 2, 3, 4, and 5. Had about 2,000th clearance or 1,000th clearance on those 4. I had 2,000th clearance on number 1, which is still under spec. And these old V-belt engines, you want a little more clearance on the front main because you want a little more oil in that bearing, in case the belts get over tightened or something puts a lot of force on this bearing. These old engines with manual tension V-belts, the front main bearing will tend to wear in the top, where the other main bearings will actually wear on the bottom, because some people put so much tension on the V-belts they actually pull the crank into the top bearing. Another oddity about this Cadillac engine, the thrust bearing is on number 3 right here, where a lot of contemporary V8s take the thrust on number 5. They take it on number 3. And then all these bearings are different. The only 2 main bearings that are the same are actually main number 2 and number 4. Number 5 is wider and has this double groove in it. And then number 1 is also wide and has a double groove in it. And strangely enough, number 1, the top and bottom, so the shell and the bottom and the main cap is the same, which is unusual for most engines. There's usually an upper and a lower. As you can see, these lower caps, the other mains, just have a groove and no holes. So anyway, we're going to get to pre-lubing the camshaft. And I'm going to go ahead and put the camshaft in because it's easier to put it in without nicking the bearings, because you can get down in here with the crank out and it won't be in our way anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-lube the comp cams we got in it. We're going to be putting the comp cams 268 grind cam in it, so it should have a little bit of a noticeable idle. Not too bad, but give her a little more power to go with the 9-to-1 compression from the flat top piston. So, and here's the other thing I was talking about, where I marked where my oil holes were so my cam bearings would line up, and back here. So I got them all marked where everything goes so it all lines up. So I'll put you all on the stand here. Trying to get my finger out of the way of the camera. And we'll go ahead and pre-lube the cam. I'll show you a picture. I'll put the cam card in that. So this is from their high energy series, I believe. It's their 268H cam. So we'll see what this does for it. The Cadillac camshaft is a little bit unusual. It's got the distributor gear made on the end of it, and then it's got a big wide pattern for the timing gears to mount. So we use our Stay Lube Moly engine assembly lube with graphite. We'll just use tons of it. Can't really have too much of this stuff. Put some in the bearings while we can get to them. So the best thing to do with the camshaft is to just shoot a bunch of this in your hand, and then just start slathering it on the camshaft. Make sure you dump a bunch of it on the floor too, that's always handy. Like I said, you can't have too much of it, so but you want this for the break-in procedure when we break the cam in when we first start the engine. And we'll put tons of this on the lifters too. And I have already test fit this camshaft, so it fits all my bearings that I put in are square and all that stuff. So the other thing that's odd about this Cadillac engine is all of the cam bearings are the same, front to rear. All 5 cam bearings are the same size. Most V8s, the key bearings taper a little bit, or they'll have different size bearings in the middle. This one does not. Let me wipe my hands off and I'll get y'all in there where you can see. And it turns smooth like butter. We got all those lobes. And we're all the way back against the thrust surface. So, now let's get some lube in the bearings and we can set the crank in there, as I've already cleaned it and got it ready to go. Let me clean up my mess on the floor here real quick. I want to make sure all of the bearing shells are square. I've got my rear main seal in, the top section of it anyway. The bottom section goes in the cab. So I want to make sure all these bearings are even, all the shells are even. You don't want one side sticking higher than the other. And then just give them a liberal coating of bearing lube, or pre-lube. Make sure we get our thrust surfaces lubed up there too on the sides of the number 3 main. But we want to make sure we don't get any of this down. We don't want to get any of this down the main bearing bolt holes, because we don't want to cause a hydro lock in the bolt holes. We've got liberal coating on everything. I'm going to put a light coating on the rear main seal here. Just a real light coating. Now this excess lube, we'll put it on the mains, on the crank itself. Once again, same deal, can't have too much. Leave my seal surface area. I'm going to wipe my hands off before I try to lift this thing in here. Lay the crank in there, make sure it turns. Alright, looks like it turns good. Need to adjust my rear main seal just a little bit. we go. Got the rear main seal nice and even. So the first main cap to go on is going to be number 3 at the thrust. You always want to do your thrust cap first. So, go get a ratchet and snug those down just a little bit before we torque them. What you want to do with the thrust main cap, you want to snug it up, but not torque it yet. Just torque it, or just snug it up to where we feel it bottom out, but we don't want to really torque down on it yet, because you need to take a rubber mallet and knock the crank forward and back. What that does is that centers the thrust bearing up. So then we can go ahead and torque this to 90 foot-pound spec. It's a good idea to draw it down even. Okay, once that's torqued, then you want to do these one at a time. You want to make sure everything turns after it's torqued. And we'll do that for each remaining main bearing. But first, we need to set up to measure the crankshaft end play. Alright, I got it set up here to check our end play. Cadillac's pretty generous with the specs, so we got, our spec is 2 thousandths to 12 thousandths. So we need to zero this out here. And we'll move it. That's moving, prying the crankshaft all the way back, so we need to pry it all the way back. Just at the zero. And now we'll pry the crankshaft forward, and we are right at 3 thousandths. So it's a good tight spec, so I think that's where we'll leave it. Now what we're going to do is just start putting caps on, work our way out from the middle. So just double check, make sure these aren't got anything in them. We don't want any dirt going through the bearings. double check and make sure our bearings are even too, because they could have moved a little bit. Turning the crank without the gaps on there. Now the rest of these we can just torque them down. We don't have to worry about moving the crank back and forth. Once again, we got one in. We'll make sure everything turns like butter. Go ahead and put this number 1 main bearing cap on. Looks like our bearing is still even. Yes, I am crazy about double checking critical torque like main bearing. So, give her a spin. Feels good. So, looks like we're gonna have to adjust this one bearing just a little bit. One bearing is slipped up on us a little bit, so take a good square, good shaped screwdriver and put it just right on the edge of the bearing. Don't use a hammer, just use your fingers. You can walk that bearing back and forth and figure out where you need it to be. There we go. That's good. Number 4 in there. Now, number 4 uses our stud bolt, get it in frame here, that supports our oil pump pickup. And I marked where that one went with an S on the cap so I know where it goes. Check and see if it turns. There we go. Sometimes you get a pack full of assembly lube, it can take a second to get it moving, but it's turning good in there. So we'll have to do a couple other special things with the rear because of the rear main seal. So let me go get set up for that. Okay, what I did on the rear main here is I put just the tiniest little spot of silicone on each end of the seal, the two pieces of the rear main seal. And then what I did here, this red stuff is anaerobic sealer. So this is like what they use on a lot of modern engines and stuff. It doesn't add thickness, so this will smash out and not affect my bearing clearance at all, but it will seal the edges of this cap to keep oil from creeping back out the back of the cap. Just one little extra safety measure to try to keep oil leaks down. Although you can never really make an old 70s engine 100% leak proof, you can at least use the modern equivalents that'll help you help out with that. It certainly doesn't hurt. Can't say it'd be 100%, but for the miles this thing will get put on it the rest of its life, it'll probably never leak. Gasket and sealing technology has come forward leaps and bounds since this engine was originally built and designed. Sometimes we can incorporate some of that modern technology in old engines. Now, I may have a problem. So I can't turn it. Well, let's stop and see what our problem is. Okay, sorry for the jumpy video. I know this video is probably a mess. It's about a week later now. Finally got the crank clearance issue sorted out. I'll show you. Got it all finalized. Everything turns like it should. I know earlier in the video it showed locked up, but on this main right here. So what we ended up having, I consulted with the machine shop and I got some telescoping gauges too, so I could check the bore outside of using plastic gauge. This main bearing was really on the tight end of the spec when I plastic gauged it, probably just a hair under spec. And what we had here was a convergence of everything being perfect, and it still wasn't right. What ended up being the case, apparently this is a nice stable block. So I ended up with a bearing bore in the block that was perfect to spec when the cap was torqued. I ended up with a main bearing that when it was in the bore and the cap is torqued, and I measured it with telescoping gauge, that it measured on the very tight end of the spec for the diameter of the bearing. What the machine shop does, they machine this crank perfectly to the high side of the spec. So nothing here was wrong. The crank wasn't wrong, the block isn't wrong, and the bearing isn't wrong. It's just everything was perfect, and that doesn't happen very often with these old 70s engines. So what I ended up having to do, the machine shop, we tried to polish the crank a little bit more to get enough clearance. That helped, but I still wasn't happy with it. So what we did is they went ahead and took just a hairs more material off of this rear bearing journal, and that got the clearance up just a little bit and seems to have fixed us up. So everything turns here. Camshaft is in it. We did that earlier in the video. That turns good. So what I'm working on now is I'm working on setting ring in gap and putting rings on pistons. So hopefully in the next video we can stuff some pistons in it and maybe get some heads on. So anyway, like and subscribe. We're moving slow. I know this isn't moving as fast as the owner would like it to. It's not moving as fast as I would like it to, but even though this is basically a stock engine, it is a one-off. It's not like we're building a small block Chevy. This engine is special in more ways than one. So anyway, have a nice day.